In an old Victorian home, the Stackpool quadruplets live a quiet life on the outskirts of town. What their neighbors don't know is that the family hides a dark secret in the basement. In front of the house, 3 of the siblings exit the main doors and stand on the porch. Wheeler was born with highly developed senses. Otis was born with extreme physical strength, while Ernestina is endowed with a near-perfect physical appearance. In the local restaurant, Howard orders his lackey, Weasel, to buy substances from Billy Boy. He tells Weasel to remind Billy Boy not to try and play him again, or he'll break his other arm. After Weasel leaves, Howard turns to his wife, Loretta, and tells her to go easy on the ice cream because he thinks she's gained weight. Loretta is annoyed by her husband's comments as Lance looks over at the couple from the cash register. A few seconds later, the Stackpool siblings enter the restaurant and Wheeler hands Lance a grocery list. Lance directs them over to the front of the restaurant, where Ray will fill it out for them. Howard greets Ernestina, but the beautiful lady has a vacant look on her face and joins her brother buy the groceries. Howard tells Lance that Ernestina is the most attractive woman he's ever seen. Lance tells him that he'll have to go through Otis first before he can get to Ernestina. Howard scoffs and says he's already got himself a woman and aggressively embraces Loretta. Afterwards, Loretta excuses herself to go to the restroom. Moments later, Lance tells Susie to watch the register while he goes to the basement. In the back room of the restaurant, Lance pulls Loretta into the storage area and the two make love. Loretta tells Lance how much better he is than her husband. In the restaurant, Howard wonders what's taking his wife so long. He goes to check the restroom but doesn't find her there. In the back room, Howard looks for Loretta and sees Lance holding a box by his waist and asks him where his wife is. A few seconds later, Loretta comes out of the employee's restroom and tells Howard the toilets in the ladies' room were busted. Lance waits for the couple to leave before zipping up his pants. Later that day, Lance sits by the restaurant and Loretta approaches him to say that Howard wants to talk to him. She doesn't think it's about what happened in the back, but Lance is still nervous. At the table, Howard assembles a handgun, then he tells Lance and Loretta to sit across from him. Lance has no idea what he wants to talk to him about. Finally, Howard explains that he wants to be partners in Lance's business, which is his way of telling him that he expects a certain amount of money from Lance every month. Loretta calls Howard a shakedown artist and he continues belittling her in front of Lance. Lance sees that he has no choice in the matter and shakes Howard's hand before the couple leaves. That evening, Susie warns Lance about Howard discovering the affair. She thinks continuing it will only end with him in a grave. However, Lance doesn't want to stop seeing Loretta because he enjoys her company too much. Later that night, Lance and Loretta make love in his car. Elsewhere, Wheeler waits by the side of the road as Otis moves an ivy-covered fence with an arrow on it, blocking the road. A few seconds later, a man in a pickup truck follows the arrow and turns left. On the drive back to town, Loretta suggests that Lance shoots Howard down so they can be together. Lance thinks that people are going to suspect the two of them if Howard disappears. However, Loretta tells him too many people despise Howard, and that they'll both meet the same fate anyway if Howard finds out about the affair. Lance is about to answer Loretta, but he steps on the brakes when he sees the ivy-covered fence on the road. Moments later, Lance steps out of the car and realizes that it's a fence that somebody placed there. He tells Loretta to stay in the car as he walks to the Stackpool house. Outside the Stackpool house, Lance hides behind the bushes and sees the 3 Stackpool siblings next to a man's truck. He reads the truck's vanity license plate, Hunk o' Love. Otis slams the man's head on the truck several times before he and Wheeler take him inside the house, while Ernestina drives the truck to the back of the house. Shocked, Lance turns around and runs to the car. In the car, Lance tells Loretta they have to leave and drives the car around the fence. Loretta asks him what he saw and he implies that he's found the solution to their predicament. 2 days later, in the Stackpool basement, the man from the pickup truck is strapped to a hospital bed, surrounded by the 4 siblings. Wheeler takes off his sunglasses, revealing his bulging eyeballs. The man is frightened and confused at what's happening as Myron tells him not to worry because he's done this many times before. The man struggles, but Otis holds him down while Wheeler places a mask over his nose and mouth. In another part of the basement, several male and female patients are locked inside a cell. They wear bloodied hospital gowns and act as though they've been lobotomized. Back at the restaurant, Susie worriedly asks Lance where he's been the last 2 days, convinced Howard disposed of him. Lance says he had out-of-town business to attend to. He then sees the 3 Stackpool siblings leave a store and goes to talk to them. Outside the restaurant, Lance tries to talk to the 3 siblings but they ignore him and continue walking. Lance tells them that he knows about the man in the truck and threatens to call the police if they refuse to talk to him. Otis grabs Lance by the neck but eventually releases him and the siblings go on their way. That night, Otis surprises Lance in his apartment and takes him back to the house. Inside the Stackpool living room, Ernestina plays the piano as Otis and Lance enter. Lance is taken aback when he sees Wheeler's eyes. Wheeler turns a lamp on, revealing Myron in his wheelchair. Terrified, Lance attempts to run out the door after seeing Myron's abnormally large head on a tiny body. Leather straps hold Myron's head up and keep it from tipping over. After Lance calms down, Myron introduces himself as the head of the family. He explains each of the siblings' unique abilities and adds that the 4 of them are linked telepathically. He's able to use his siblings' bodies anytime he wants to by simply using his mind. Moments later, Lance tells Myron about how he saw Otis take the man in a pickup truck inside the house, and Ernestina driving the truck to the back where the family has a swamp. He says that he spotted the license plate and wouldn't be surprised if there were more cars already at the bottom of the swamp. Myron asks Lance why they should care, especially since they already have him inside the house. Lance reveals that he wrote everything he saw in a letter and met with the lawyer he instructed to send the letter to the state's attorney's office if he ever ends up missing. After a quick pause, Myron instructs Lance to press a button on the intercom to hear the man in the surgical annex. When Lance presses the button, he hears the screams of the patients. Myron tells him that he performs experiments in the basement because he's looking for a body that will withstand his large mental capacity. He's tired of living by proxy, having to use his siblings. He asks Lance if he's there to help the people in the basement, but Lance says he has his own problems he'd like taken care of. Lance tells Myron that if he wants to continue his experiments and keep the police from snooping around, he and the siblings need to make Howard go away. Then he asks Myron if they have a deal, and Myron contemplates. The following day, Howard eats his meal in the restaurant while Lance and Loretta make love at the back. He tells her to have an alibi ready for tomorrow when Howard goes out of town so nobody suspects them. The following evening, Howard drives his motorcycle and sees Ernestina all alone by the side of the road. He stops and approaches her, asking for a kiss. Unexpectedly, Otis creeps up behind him and knocks him out. At the restaurant, Lance answers the phone and hears Myron confirm that they've done what he's asked. Lance thanks Myron and hangs up the phone. That night, Loretta sneaks into Lance's apartment and giddily asks him if Howard really is gone. He assures her that he got it done because he had the Stackpools do it for him. Then, he tells her about how he used the things he saw that night to blackmail the family into doing his dirty work. He also plans on continuing to extort the Stackpools of their money. In the Stackpool basement, Otis feeds the patients by giving them 1 raw potato each. Howard is in the cell with the others, missing 1 eye and functions like he's been lobotomized. Upstairs in the living room, Lance meets with the siblings and says he won't give them the letter just yet. He shows them the guns he brought to protect himself and demands they give him $2,000 every week. Myron points him to a drawer where Lance takes a wad of cash and leaves. Myron furiously orders Wheeler to follow Lance and find out anything they can to use against him. Days later, Susie asks Loretta if she's heard from Howard and she says she hasn't heard anything and that it's been a week. Lance plays along and asks if she's called the police. Loretta almost slips and says that she did call the police just like Lance told her to, but she catches herself mid-sentence. She thinks finding Howard isn't one of the police's top priorities. Shortly after, Susie has a coughing fit and excuses herself from the conversation. Lance leans in closer to Loretta and they flirtily whisper with each other in the middle of the restaurant. Unbeknownst to them, Wheeler is in the alley, listening to their conversation and telepathically sending it to Myron. That night, Wheeler stands outside Lance's apartment building, eavesdropping on the couple. Inside the apartment, Lance and Loretta drink expensive champagne that he bought using the money he extorted from the Stackpools. Back at the Stackpool house, Myron relishes in the information Wheeler collected and remembers every detail. In the meantime, Ernestina stands next to him and feeds him soup. The next day, Lance offers Susie the chance to own half the restaurant and run it herself. He explains that he's come upon bigger opportunities and wants to do more than run a restaurant. He tells Susie to think about it and walks over to the phone. He makes a scheduled call to his lawyer, Mr. Rasco, who asks him what his mom's dog name was. He answers the question and the lawyer confirms his identity and they end the call. Outside the building, Wheeler continues listening in on all of Lance's conversations. At the bus terminal, Wheeler and Otis buy round-trip tickets to Raleigh to see Rasco. Outside Rasco's office, Otis knocks out the secretary and he and Wheeler enter the office. They tell the lawyer to give them Lance's letter while Otis threatens to break his fingers. Frightened, Rasco opens the safe and gives them the letter. Wheeler asks him if there's other copies, but Rasco swears that it's the only one. Then, Otis snaps the lawyer's neck and the two men leave the office. At the back of the restaurant, Lance and Loretta have their usual rendezvous and he proposes to her in the middle of it. Loretta is elated and asks to see the ring, but Lance hasn't bought the ring, to her disappointment. He tells her to punch him in the chest to feel better and she obliges. She forgives him and they share a hug before Susie calls him up to the restaurant to take a phone call. In the restaurant, Lance picks up the phone and Myron tells him he'll receive a delivery tonight, alone. Myron hangs up before Lance can ask any more questions. That evening, Ernestina lets herself in Lance's apartment and hands him the cash. She then seduces him and soon the two share an intimate night while Wheeler listens from outside. In the middle of the tryst, Ernestina moves out of the way, then Otis knocks Lance out with a punch. In Loretta's apartment, Otis enters the bedroom and touches her hair. Loretta wakes up and is frightened, but he promises that he won't hurt her. Myron is inside Otis's brain and tells him to do as he says despite Otis trying his best to fight Myron's orders. Eventually, Otis grabs Loretta and forces her to come with him. In the Stackpool basement, Lance lies on an inclined surgical table and Myron looks at him. Lance figures out the siblings found Rasco and have the letter. Myron tells him that the letter is gone and so is his lawyer. Seconds later, Otis brings in Loretta and makes her kneel on the floor. Lance tells Myron that he knew they'd find Rasco eventually, so he contacted another lawyer to mail the letter if anything ever happens to Rasco. Myron thinks there's a flaw in Lance's plan and that he'll get the second lawyer's name out of him by hurting Loretta. Lance tells Myron to go ahead with what he wants to do, and Loretta begs him to just tell Myron the lawyer's name. He says that keeping his mouth shut is the only way they'll survive. A few seconds later, Loretta hatches a plan of her own. She moves closer to Myron and starts complimenting his intelligence and how she's always been attracted to intellect. At first, Myron doesn't take her seriously and sees what she's trying to do. However, the more Loretta talks, the more interested he becomes, especially when she removes her clothes. Myron asks Loretta if she's only taking advantage of his loneliness. Loretta lies and convinces him further that she actually wants him. Myron licks his lips suggestively and sticks out his abnormally long tongue to lick her body part. Myron snaps out of his crush on Loretta and wishes to continue with his initial plans for her. As Otis drags Loretta away, she pleads to Myron to spare her. Later, inside a small theater room, Lance is held down in his seat by Otis. Myron explains that his family has staged plays in the room for over a century and he now uses his patients to act in said plays. Tonight's show is Joan of Arc, and Loretta will be playing the titular Joan. The play will end with her burning at the stake, unless Lance tells him the second lawyer's name. Lance tries to fight Otis's hold on him but still refuses to give Myron the name. The play starts and the patients recite their lines with no emotion. Soon, Loretta is brought out for her scene and she is held on stage by two other male patients. To get Loretta to say her lines, Myron presses a button on his chair that sends an electric current to the collar around the woman's neck. When the scene calls for her to be tied to the stake, the patients tie her hands up above her head. The play continues and one of the patients rips off her dress. She tells Lance to tell Myron the lawyer's name, but he still refuses since it's his only bargaining chip. One patient lights up a torch with a lighter just as Loretta reads her lines regarding the flames consuming her and realizes what's about to happen. Afraid, Loretta begs Lance to give Myron what he wants, but he still won't do it. Suddenly, the wood beneath Loretta's feet erupts in flames when the torch touches it and she screams. Meanwhile, Otis watches Loretta engulfed in flames and is conflicted. He doesn't want to see Loretta get hurt, so he fights Myron's mental hold on him and rushes to the stage to save her. He carries her to the side stage and Myron chases them in his wheelchair. Shortly after, Lance fights off Wheeler and escapes the theater. In the basement, Otis carries Loretta through the cell where she sees Howard. Otis takes her to a room with a breaker panel and flips a switch that'll cause the house to burn. In the second floor hallway, Lance catches up to Myron. Lance pushes Myron's chair to the top of stairs and tips it over, causing Myron to tumble down and lose consciousness. Afterward, Lance continues down to the basement, yelling Loretta's name. Ernestina appears around a corner and asks Lance to save her before retreating into the shadows. Lance follows her to the cell where Wheeler surprises and attacks him with a knife, stabbing him multiple times. Lance pushes Wheeler off him but collapses to the ground. At the bottom of the stairs, Ernestina kneels beside Myron, taking his last breaths. Outside the house, Otis and Loretta watch as the Stackpool home burns. Suddenly, it dawns on Loretta that Otis is the only remaining heir to the Stackpool fortune. Days later, Loretta and Otis get married in a civil ceremony, and Loretta gives her new husband a big smile. Otis laughs maniacally with a wild look in his eyes.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.